Did you know electric vehicles once looked like this, and even this? In fact, they were the very first mass-produced motor cars to gain popularity. Over the years, they've ranged from practical and cool to odd and downright bizarre. Join us as we delve into the history of the earliest EVs and the weird and wonderful electric vehicles that saw the light of day before we got to today. Think electric cars are new, think again. Over 100 years ago, EVs had put an end to the era of horse-drawn carriages, and along with it, the need to dodge horse droppings. EVs proved more convenient than steam cars, and easier, cheaper, and cleaner to run than their gas-guzzling rivals. So why did the world abandon these once-beloved machines? In the early 1900s, ICEs needed to be hand-cranked, plus they rattled and shook rather a lot. And fuel was more expensive than electricity, all of which worked in the favor of EVs, until the American oil boom and the Ford Model T knocked electric vehicles off their pedestal. But over the course of history, the hope for battery-powered mobility never died, and especially when the threat of an oil crisis loomed, EVs had a habit of popping up, renewing the belief that they could solve the transport sector's energy woes. As recently as a few years ago, electric vehicles were considered machines of the future, ones that might someday prove to be the ideal way to meet our tailpipe emission-free goals. But even as they become increasingly common, manufacturers, energy companies, and governments around the world are pushing to develop battery technology, charging infrastructure, and EV policies. And even while the debate rages on as to whether or not EVs truly can be the best way forward for our automotive future, it's easy to forget that they once were an integral part of our automotive past. The early days of EVs were experimental to say the least. After all, it was the 1800s, a time of scientific discovery, innovation, and rapid progress which saw the invention of modes of transport like the steam locomotive and the velocipede. Some credit for getting us moving electrically goes to Hungarian priest and inventor Anyos István Jedlik. He developed the lightning magnetic self-rotor, touted as the world's first electric motor. In 1828, he used this to propel a model car, setting the stage for further automotive development.
Gas, electricity, and steam are competing for supremacy as the propulsive power in the early automobile.
In 1832, Scottish inventor Robert Anderson developed what's considered the world's first fully electric vehicle. It was essentially a carriage propelled by an electric motor. Unfortunately, though, the rechargeable battery hadn't been invented at the time, and once the machine had moved forward at its glacial top speed of 12 kilometers an hour and exhausted the energy in its battery, the battery needed to be thrown away and replaced with a new one. Not the most practical solution for an urban runabout. In 1859, French physicist Gaston Planté invented the rechargeable battery, and EVs started making progress on rail and road. In 1884, Englishman Thomas Parker began experimenting with prototype EVs, and in 1890 in the US, William Morrison applied for a patent on an electric car he'd built a few years earlier. It caused quite a stir and sparked the imagination of various inventors, like Henry G. Morris and Pedro Salem, who built the Electrobat, the first commercially viable electric car. They even made electric cabs which operated in cities like New York at the turn of the century. Believe it or not, these cabs ran almost uninterrupted thanks to their ingenious method of battery swapping that involved a crane and took all of 3 minutes. EVs were getting quicker too. Belgian Camille Janazzi became the first person in the world to break the 100-kilometer-an-hour barrier in his purpose-built electric race car, La Jamais Contente. French for never content, after which EVs seemed unstoppable. In fact, the first car Ferdinand Porsche had a hand in building, the Eggerlohner C2 Phaeton, was an EV. Electric cars were simply taking over the streets. Things changed around 1908. More and more Model Ts began rolling off Henry Ford's assembly lines. That, along with the discovery of cheap crude oil in Texas, made the ICE a tempting proposition. The final nail in the EV coffin was Charles Kettering's electric self-starter, which eliminated the inconvenience of hand-cranking a car. By 1923, the Model T cost half what an EV did, which meant the Tin Lizzie, as it had been nicknamed, was simply everywhere and had left the electric car eating its dust.
The nation took the Model T to its heart. People called it a flivver, made jokes about it, loved it.
By around the 1930s, electric vehicles were for all intents and purposes dead. Of course, there were a few exceptions, like in England, where electric milk floats continued to be the norm from the time they were invented until around the 1980s. And although the first EVs had seemingly disappeared from the face of the earth, World War II did precipitate the invention of two rather significant machines, like this one. The Peugeot VLV, or Voiture Légère de Ville, which translates to light city car. This mini cabriolet with staggered seating was possibly the world's first electric microcar. The VLV raised quite a few eyebrows when it was first announced, since no French car makers at the time were considering electric propulsion. But with parts of France under German occupation, the VLV was Peugeot's clever way of sidestepping the fuel restriction imposed on French civilians. VLVs were mainly used by postal workers and doctors, but after just 377 units were produced, the Nazis banned the car's use. A few years later, post-war Japan was suffering from a severe shortage of oil, so running automobiles on electricity, which was cheap and plentiful, seemed like a good idea. So the Tokyo Electric Automobile Company came up with this, the Tama. Between 1947 and 51, Tamas could be seen plying Japan's roads primarily as taxis. And the fact that the Tokyo Electric Automobile Company eventually morphed into Prince Automotive, which in turn became Datsun Nissan, means that long before the Leaf, Nissan had a successful EV in the form of the Tama. Across the pond, attempts to build EVs hadn't ground to a complete halt, and one of the first EVs in nearly 2 decades that showed promise just happened to be built by an electricity company that owned both a coach builder and a company that manufactured vacuum cleaners. In 1959, the Henny Motor Company, owned by the National Union Electric Company, which also owned Eureka Williams, created an EV called the Henny Kilowatt. Taking the shell and underpinnings from a Renault Dauphine, they replaced the rear engine with an electric motor and stored the batteries under the hood. National Union Electric was keen to manufacture EVs because they also produced the Excite batteries which powered these cars. But no storage space meant the EVs weren't very practical, and they were expensive too. Of the 100 kilowatts built, reportedly only 47 were ever sold, mostly to other electric companies. So, hopes that the Henny Kilowatt would become the next big EV were crushed pretty quickly. Then came the first proper EV attempt in decades by an American car maker, General Motors' Electroware. In 1964, GM took a Chevy Corvair and fitted it with a battery pack. 2 years later, they went back to the drawing board using a 1966 Monza hardtop model to come up with the Electroware 2. The car had an induction motor at the rear and a battery pack up front, and was by far the coolest looking EV manufactured up until then. The drawback was the battery was extremely heavy and needed to be replaced between the 6,500 and 12,500 kilometer mark, which meant that the car was effectively a non-starter. GM also tried their hand at building an electrified Chevette called the Electrovette in the late 1970s. They were confident that their battery technology had significantly improved by then.
This is a zinc nickel oxide battery, which has about 2 to 2.5 times the energy storage capability of the lead acid batteries, which were formerly the only ones available. So this really is the breakthrough that makes possible an electric car like this.
But despite testing multiple battery chemistries, the Electrovette simply didn't deliver on its promises. Other experimental American EVs of that era include General Electric's Delta and Ford's Commuta prototype. But perhaps a General Motors EV from that era that can be considered something of a success wasn't even an EV that did most of its motoring on the surface of the Earth. The Lunar Roving Vehicles, or LRVs, were battery-powered four-wheelers used during the last 3 Apollo missions. A joint effort by Boeing and General Motors, the first LRV was deployed on July 31, 1971 during the Apollo 15 mission. The aim to help astronauts cover more lunar surface during their expedition. Astronaut Eugene Cernan even set the unofficial lunar land speed record when he hit 18 kilometers an hour in one. The lunar rovers were abandoned on the moon after Apollo missions 15, 16 and 17, where they remain to this day. Companies across the Atlantic were keen not to be left behind. In 1966, Enfield Automotive in England produced 120 E8000 electric cars, of which 65 were used by the UK's Electricity Council. People took to them.
Well, on average, you get a range of about 40 miles. It's adequate for my particular purposes, and we clock up 30 to 40 miles a day.
And British engineer Alistair Carter developed an EV called the Carter Coaster in 1967. Carter was so confident EVs were the way forward, he even told the Daily Mail that he believed 250,000 such cars would be on British roads within 5 short years. And these weren't the only examples.
And over at the British Motor Corporation's Longbridge headquarters, they don't intend to be left behind. In conjunction with a battery firm, it's planned to build an electric town car within 2 years. That's what ace car designer Alec Isigonis is working hard at.
With an oil crisis looming, fears of future fuel shortages led several countries to start making concerted efforts to revive EVs.
Until 1950, the United States could supply the energy needed. But in less than 25 years, we found ourselves in trouble.
So the US Congress passed the Electric Hybrid Vehicle Research, Development and Demonstration Act of 1976. But long before that, in Germany, Opel was already breaking speed records in their Elektro GT at Hockenheim, and BMW had already displayed their first electric car at the 1972 Munich Olympics. 2 BMW 1602 EVs were used to ferry people around and to support track and field and marathon events. Comically, the car's range was just a bit longer than a full marathon distance, after which it needed a new battery. Volkswagen was at it too, testing a battery-powered microbus or bully back in 1972. The Electrobus was the brainchild of their Department of Future Research, and like the turn-of-the-century Electrobat, also featured battery swapping. The boffins from Wolfsburg implemented regenerative braking in the machine too. Though an actual electric VW bus, the ID Buzz only hit the market 40 years later. VW's attempts to combat the fuel crisis of the 70s even extended to their most popular model. In fact, this was the Electro Golf from 1976. VW engineers built 20 of them and drove them around Wolfsburg for 10 years, gathering data on how they could improve battery tech for electric cars.
See that? That's not a fuel filler, that's a socket. This car runs on electricity from the batteries up front, and they're charged via this socket here.
New versions included the Golf 1 City Stromer in 1981, the Golf 2 City Stromer in 1985, and the Golf 3 City Stromer in 93. But it wasn't until 2014 that VW began to seriously consider EVs again with their e-Golf. Let's flash forward to the 90s, when attempts were being made to bring EVs into the present, or, judging by the design of this machine, the future. American car makers were under growing pressure from California to sell a certain percentage of zero-emission vehicles if they wanted to do business in the state. So GM built and sold the EV1 from 96 to 99. Now seen as something of a cult car, back then rumors abounded that GM sabotaged the EV1's chances in order to keep selling ICEs. Jump ahead to 2012 and Silicon Valley was taking over, with Tesla's Roadster becoming the best-selling American-made EV. But it was a brave little car that wore this crown until then, the Sebring Vanguard City Car. Conceived by Bob Beaumont, around 4,500 of these cheese wedges on wheels were sold between 1974 and 1977. A change in ownership meant it was eventually rebranded the commuter car and also came in a longer commuter van variant. It signaled the sort of EV people wanted to drive at the time, and it was way ahead of electric quadricycles like the Opel Roxy or the Microlino. This desire for small practical electric cars made its presence felt around the world in the 2000s. In India, the Reva Electric Car Company sold the Reva and even exported it to the UK as the G-Wiz. And in Norway, spurred on by synth-pop eco-heroes AHA, Norwegians turned to two domestic models, the Buddy EV and the Think City. Much like their spiritual forefathers, none of these little machines stood the test of time, but they kept the spark of the EV dream alive. Today, electric vehicles have gone relatively mainstream and come in all manner of conventional shapes and sizes. They might not be the most common machines on the road. Fear still abounds as to whether or not they can be truly convenient, and the jury is still out as to whether or not they're likely to save the planet. But even as manufacturers flip-flop about whether or not they're going fully electric, one thing we can all agree on is the era of the quirky electric vehicle is gone. And it's a downright shame that we won't see any of these unusual machines brightening up the cityscape as we motor along. Machines like the truly bizarre Corbin Sparrow, which quite frankly looked like a giant toe. Or the Sinclair C5, which was like a tiny electric go-kart or an accident waiting to happen. Or Opel's twin concept, which let you swap the combustion engine at the back for a battery-powered rear. Of course, some of these machines were non-starters, a little too odd and impractical to use. But if they hadn't been invented, we might not be able to drive around in modern EVs today. Or look back at the history of EVs with a mixture of admiration and amusement. After all, the weird and wonderful arguably do have a role to play in the course of innovation. What's your favorite oddball EV, and have there been unusual EVs in your part of the world that we ought to know about? We'd love to hear from you in the comments.